I mean, it comes through so much to me. I say the word philosophy a lot. I personally love philosophy. I think everybody should be a philosopher in just the spirit of like thinking, questioning, wondering. And it sounds like for you, like that's always been there. Like you've always been thinking about the purpose, like even that point where you're working those two jobs, whatever, the fast food restaurant. A lot of people, they don't even think about it. Maybe it's a survival mechanism, maybe it's not. I don't know. They just keep their head down and they go, even through later in life, like to actually step back and reflect and be like, how am I feeling about this? Like, what's my purpose here? Like this, there has to be more than this. A lot of people think like they're not sure if that's a gift or a curse to have that. So I guess a
Mhm.
two-part question. One, like where did that come from for you? That like philosophical view of like always wondering about purpose and what you're here for. And do you view it as a gift or a curse that you're constantly thinking about that?
I mean, I think part of it is having undiagnosed ADHD early in life. I think that's probably a big part of it because your brain bounces around and
Mm,
thinks and overthinks like everything. That's a big part of having ADHD is like your brain just kind of like questioning everything and bouncing from one topic to the other.
that's interesting.
And so you're like, I've never been hyperactive in the sense of like bouncing off the walls, but I've been hyperactive like in my head. So I think that that's sort of a big part of it is that my brain was always thinking and overthinking. Like it wasn't unusual for me to like listen to a podcast, then get an idea that I could apply in my life somewhere else from a fully unrelated like topic on the podcast. Because my brain would hear A and get to like D, like I bounced around enough to like get to the place that was useful and applicable to my life. So I've always sort of done that. And I think that having undiagnosed ADHD was a big part of that. So I think to that extent, it's a little bit of a curse in that I didn't know why it was happening, you know? Like I think that had I been diagnosed early on and known that it was a thing that I had and it was why, because now that I understand it, I'm grateful that I have it
Mm.
and it's part of who I am. And like I understand that part of myself better because like I'm grateful that I overthink things and that I can see things from a different perspective and that I can sort of like hear one thing and translate it into a thing that makes sense into like projects I'm working on or whatever. Like I love that part about myself, but it's something that when you don't understand it, it feels like a curse because
Mm.
you're overthinking everything. So I think that that's a big part of where that comes from for me. Um, and I mean, like I've always been the kid to ask why, right, in class. Like I was always the kid to be like, okay, so we learned this fact, but like, why is that the thing that happened? So I think that that's also maybe part of it. Is like I've always been sort of curious and wanted to dig deeper.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought of it in that way. The ADHD paired with like the questioning and the philosophical, like trying to understand. I'd never thought of it in that way, but that makes a lot of sense because I would normally ask a question there of like, why do you think you always wanted to know why? Like, what was it that you were searching for ultimately? And it makes me wonder. I won't put words in your mouth. I'm curious your take, but like, maybe there's an answer to that. Maybe you were trying to figure out life. Maybe it goes back to that game concept where you're like, I'm here, I'm playing this game. I need to understand the rules so I can understand how to play it
Mm,
best as possible. Or maybe it was just a function of the ADHD where it's just like, that's just how your mind worked. It needed to
yeah.
constantly kind of look and search and be busy and doing more things. Do you think it's one or the other? Maybe both, right? I mean, I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think it's very much ADHD in like a good way because like a big part of ADHD is you can't motivate yourself to do things. Like it's hard to motivate yourself to do things if you don't care about it.
Mm.
And it's hard to care about something that you don't understand, right? So
Mm.
like if I'm learning a thing in school that I don't fully understand why I'm learning it, I'm not going to care about it. But if I can figure out a way to understand why I'm learning it, or at least convince myself that there's a good reason to learn it, then I'm more likely to care about it.
Mm.
You know?
That's super interesting. I mean, it kind of goes back to what you were saying before about the jobs. Like, if you can't
Yeah,
figure out why this job matters and you should care about it, you just can't do it.
yeah,
And it's weird because that phrase you just said of like, and I'm gonna make a statement here that hopefully you understand what I mean by it. Like, a lot of people would think like, oh, that's the downside of ADHD. Like, you can't do things unless you understand it and care about it. Like that must. But in some ways, it's like, what? Like, shouldn't everybody be like that? Shouldn't
yeah.
we only do things we can understand and care and understand there's meaning to? Like, so in so many ways, that seems like the obvious approach to life. But it feels like a lot of people, and I'm not judging anybody, like we all have our issues, but feels like for a lot of people that's a foreign statement to them. That idea that I need to understand it before I could care about it. And I relate to that very much, but it's interesting that I think a lot of people don't.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing that I think about a lot. Like I listen to a lot of like political podcasts that really dig into like the politics of different news topics that are happening. And I think that they say a lot on there is like, but the majority of voters aren't actually this tuned in. Like they don't care as much about this. They just don't know what's going on because they're overwhelmed with life. And like it's understandable that they are. But then I think back and like I've always been overwhelmed with life in some way or another. But then I've always been tuned into the things that matter, at least that I thought mattered, you know? So it seems like such a weird concept to me that people would go through life and it wouldn't cross their mind. Like, how could I make life better for me? Or how could I make life better for other people? And it's so strange to think that that doesn't cross people's mind.